It sounds dramatic now, but that's the sentence that keeps looping in my head every time I hear a dog bark late at night. Back then, everything looked normal. Trimmed lawns, porch lights, the soft hum of televisions through open windows. The kind of neighborhood where nothing ever happens unless you let it. That was the problem. We all let it. My neighbor didn't look dangerous. He waved at the same time every morning, wore the same faded jacket, and smiled like someone who practiced in a mirror. There was nothing you'd call threatening. Just small things that felt off if you stood still long enough. He never went inside his house while I was watching. He stood too close when we talked, close enough that I could smell old coffee on his breath. He knew when I worked late, when my lights stayed on, when my car wasn't in the driveway. I assumed coincidence. Everyone does. What I didn't know then was that other people noticed things too. A door opening at the wrong hour. A voice that sounded familiar before it should have. We never compared notes. We smiled, waved, and went back inside. Silence felt safer than being wrong. By the time I realized silence was the invitation, it was already too late. What happened next doesn't fit neatly into words. Only fragments and the certainty that I helped it happen by pretending not to see. That night changed how I look at walls, fences, and the people who share them. It also wasn't the only story I heard. Just the first one I lived long enough to tell. I started saving messages, screenshots, half-written apologies, anything that felt like evidence. When I finally spoke up, it wasn't to the police. It was to strangers online, people who listened, people who had their own versions. That's how I learned this wasn't isolated. Some asked me to share more, to compare details, to stop pretending together now. This wasn't the first neighbor like this. Just the first I survived. Before I go any further, I need to explain why I'm telling you this at all. None of these stories came from a single place. They arrived the same way most bad truths do now. Quietly, buried in emails, direct messages, half-finished posts sent at 3 in the morning and deleted an hour later. Some of them were framed as confessions. Others read like someone trying to prove they weren't crazy. A few were marked urgent, followed by nothing ever again. I started keeping them after the first incident, thinking patterns might emerge if I lined them up side by side. They did. Just not the kind that makes you feel safer. If you've watched my previous uploads, you've already heard echoes of these cases. Different streets, different names, same details rearranged. Neighbors who blend in too well. Houses that never quite feel empty. People who notice something is wrong and wait, assuming someone else will speak first. Last year, there were stories I didn't upload. Not because they weren't compelling, but because they were too similar. Too close. Reading them back felt like reading instructions written by different hands. That was the moment I realized this wasn't random. There's an unspoken rule running through all of them. The neighbors who scare you aren't the loud ones. They're the ones you stop noticing, the ones who fit so perfectly into the background that questioning them feels rude. If any of this reminds you of someone near you, don't ignore that thought. Don't dismiss it as paranoia yet. Compare notes. Pay attention. Because the first email in this collection came from someone who thought their neighbor was just lonely. That assumption, more than fear, is what gives these stories room to breathe and spread, long before anyone realizes they are already involved. The first time I met him, he knocked on my door holding an empty mug and an apologetic smile. "Sorry," he said before I could even speak. "I'm your neighbor. I just moved in. Do you happen to have some sugar?" It was late afternoon, the safe part of the day. Sun's still out. Kids biking somewhere down the block. I remember thinking he looked relieved when I opened the door, like he'd been rehearsing that sentence for a while, and was glad to finally get it out. I handed him the sugar. He didn't step inside. He didn't even cross the threshold. He just stood there, close enough that I had to lean back slightly, nodding too much, thanking me twice. When he left, he waved like we'd known each other longer than 30 seconds. After that, he found reasons to talk to me. Packages accidentally, delivered to his place. Questions about trash pickup days. Comments about the weather that felt strangely scripted, like he was hitting conversational checkpoints. He laughed a half second after jokes landed, not with them. He never invited me over, I realized that later. He talked about his house constantly, how drafty it was, how the floors creaked, but he never went inside while I was around. If I saw him outside, he stayed outside. If I came home and he was already there, he waited until I went in first. The question started small. Do you always work that late? Is that your car, or does someone visit often? You live alone, right? I answered without thinking. Everyone does it first. I told myself he was lonely. New neighborhood. Socially awkward. I laughed it off. I shouldn't have. Sometimes he repeated things I'd said days earlier, word for word, like quotes he'd memorized. When I reacted, he smiled wider, like he'd passed a test. He stood too close every time. Close enough that backing up felt rude. Once I asked him what he did for work. He paused longer than necessary. I watch, he said, then corrected himself quickly. I work nights. I told myself that was nothing. The neighborhood stayed quiet. Lawns stayed trimmed. Porch lights turned on at dusk like clockwork. He waved every morning. I waved back. The first time he came over at night, he didn't knock. I only realized he was there because my dog stopped breathing. That's the only way I can describe it. Not barking, not growling, just freezing mid-step, ears pinned, like the air itself had changed. I heard the sound a second later, soft, deliberate footsteps on my porch. No knock, no doorbell. Just waiting as if he already knew I was awake. When I opened the door, he smiled the same practiced smile. You left your kitchen light on, he said. I thought you might want to know. I hadn't. I was sure of it, but I thanked him anyway. That became the pattern. He showed up uninvited, always polite, always with a reason that sounded helpful if you didn't examine it too closely. He knew my schedule now, knew when I showered, when I ate, when I slept badly enough to pace. Then he started talking like me, not copying my voice, not exactly, copying phrases, cadence. Jokes I'd made days earlier, dropped casually into conversation like shared memories. When I asked him about it, he tilted his head and said, You said that once. I liked how it sounded. I stopped laughing things off. I started locking my doors. That's when I noticed the basement. His house had one. Same model as mine. Same layout. But while every other basement window on the block was either covered or glowing faintly, his were black. Completely. No dust, no reflection. Just empty rectangles cut into the foundation. One night, while taking out the trash, I heard something from below ground. Not words. Rhythm. Like someone practicing speech without sound. I asked him about it the next day. He blinked, slow and deliberate. Oh, he said, you hear them too. That was the first time I considered calling the police. Instead, I talked to another neighbor. Casually, carefully. I asked if they'd noticed anything strange. They hesitated. That was enough. A week later, I found writing on my fence. Not graffiti, notes. Dates, times, things I'd done. Things I hadn't realized anyone could see. Some were crossed out, some circled, all of them accurate. When I confronted him, he looked genuinely confused. I thought you knew, he said. The last people knew. That night, the sounds through the shared wall didn't stop. Whispering, overlapping, familiar and wrong. I packed a bag and left. I called the police from my car, hands shaking, voice too calm. They came. They searched. They called me back an hour later. There was no one living next door. No furniture. No records. No basement access. Just an empty house with fresh footprints leading nowhere. That was the least disturbing one. You're probably thinking you'd have moved the moment he asked those questions. Everyone says that. It's comforting to imagine yourself as the person who listens to instincts, who packs a bag at the first chill and never looks back. I used to think that too. Here's the ugly truth: most warning signs sound stupid when they arrive. They sound like overthinking, like being rude, like the kind of story people laugh about later, usually right before saying, but seriously, you're fine. I replay those moments now and they feel obvious. Of course the questions were rehearsed. Of course he stood too close. Of course a grown man borrowing sugar twice a week wasn't about sugar. But at the time, it was easier to believe I was being dramatic than to believe something was wrong with the world right outside my door. Normalcy is a powerful drug. It convinces you to explain things away just to keep your routines intact. Dinner still tastes the same. Bills still show up. The porch light still turns on at dusk. If you admit something is wrong, then you have to act, and action has consequences. Silence feels cheaper. Sometimes I joke about it now, the way people joke about near misses. At least he was polite. I'll say forcing a laugh that doesn't quite land. Humor makes it sound survivable, manageable, like a story with a clean ending. But not all of them are like that. The next story doesn't have a basement or police reports. It doesn't even have a face you can point to. Just a house, a neighbor you never see, and the slow realization that being watched doesn't always come from eyes. I moved into the house on Alder Street because it was quiet in the way only finished neighborhoods are. No construction, no parties, no kids, just identical homes spaced evenly apart like teeth that had grown in straight and clean. The realtor called it peaceful. I believed her. The first thing I noticed about my neighbor's house was that the lights were always on. Every window, every night. Soft yellow glow behind curtains that never opened all the way. At first, I thought someone worked odd hours. Then I realized the lights never changed. Same brightness, same rooms. Even at 3 in the morning, even during storms, even when the power flickered everywhere else. I never saw anyone go in or out. That shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. Not in a sharp, immediate way. More like a pressure you don't realize you're carrying until you set something down. I started glancing at the windows without meaning to, checking if anything had shifted. It never did. The curtains moved, though, just slightly. Not enough to be obvious. Enough that I second-guessed myself. Enough that I told myself it was airflow settling fabric. Anything but intention. The house across the street had wind chimes. I focused on those instead. After the first week, I installed security cameras. Not because I was afraid, because that would have meant admitting something. I told myself it was for packages. The cameras covered my driveway, my front door, the side yard. None of them pointed at the neighbor's house. I avoided that on purpose. That didn't stop the feeling. Sometimes, when I stood in my kitchen at night, I felt watched from behind, even though the windows faced the yard. I started closing the blinds earlier. I lowered my voice when I talked on the phone. I stopped pacing. One night, while brushing my teeth, I mentioned out loud that I was thinking of taking a weekend trip. Just a thought. No plans. The next morning, the neighbor's porch light was off for the first time. It came back on when I got home from work. That's when I started paying attention to patterns. When I stayed up late, a single light upstairs flicked off. When I overslept, it stayed on. When I skipped dinner, the kitchen window brightened. It felt ridiculous, like assigning meaning to random noise, but the timing was too precise. Too reactive. I tested it once. I stood in my living room and said clearly, "I'm not home tonight." The upstairs light across the way went dark. I didn't leave. I didn't sleep either. A few days later, I noticed something else. A narrow access panel in my garage, half hidden behind shelves. It led into a crawl space I hadn't explored. When I shined a flashlight inside, I saw insulation, dust, and something newer cutting through the old wood. A passage. Not wide enough to walk through comfortably. Wide enough to move. It angled toward the neighbor's property line, disappearing into darkness, as if the houses had been closer than advertised all along. I didn't go into the crawl space right away. I told myself I needed daylight tools, a rational head. The truth was simpler once I confirmed it was real. I'd have to decide what to do about it. Ignoring things had worked before, or at least it had felt like it had. The rules started showing themselves after that. They weren't written anywhere. No notes, no warnings. Just consequences that arrived quietly when I stepped out of line. The first one was about routine. I realized this when I stayed home sick from work without saying anything out loud. The house across the street responded anyway. One light shut off, then another, then all of them, one by one, until the place was completely dark for the first time since I'd moved in. An hour later, they came back on together. I understood then that deviation was noticed, not tolerated. I tried to live smaller after that. I ate at the same times, slept at the same hour. I stopped making phone calls inside my house. When I needed to talk, I went for walks. Even then, I felt watched, like the attention followed patterns instead of distance. The sounds began shortly after. Soft taps from inside my walls, always in sets of 3. Never loud enough to justify panic. Just enough to register. When I changed my routine too much, the taps moved closer to wherever I was standing. Kitchen, Bedroom, bathroom, always 3. I went online searching for anything similar. At first, I found nothing useful. Then I found threads that ended abruptly, usernames deleted, posts archived with replies missing, people describing houses that responded, neighbors who never appeared, routines enforced by architecture itself. One thread mentioned lights as language. Another talked about sound as correction. Most of them ended the same way: silence. I dug into property records next. The neighborhood was newer than it looked. Built in phases, replacing something older. The neighbor's house, though, predated the rest by decades. Renovated, not rebuilt. Folded into the new development like a preserved organ in a younger body. Previous tenants came and went quickly. 6 months. 3 months. One record listed no forwarding address at all. Another simply stopped updating. That was when I broke another rule. I opened the crawl space. It smelled old and damp, like a place that had never been meant to connect anything. I crawled in with a flashlight, heart hammering loud enough that I worried it could be heard. The passage stretched farther than it should have, sloping gently downward. Halfway through, I saw markings on the beams. Scratches, tallies, grouped in 3s. I didn't reach the end. I didn't need to. That night, every light in the neighbor's house went out at once. The street felt wrong without the glow. Empty. Exposed. Then the tapping started again, louder this time. Not just from one wall, but all of them. 3 taps. Pause. 3 taps. Pause. Like something learning the shape of my fear. I tried to leave the next morning. Packed my car. Didn't announce it. Didn't test anything. As I opened my front door, every light across the street turned on at once, brighter than I'd ever seen them. The curtains pulled back for the first time. There was nothing behind them. No furniture. No shadows. No movement. Just empty rooms. Walls stripped to studs, wires exposed like veins. A house pretending to be lived in. That was when I understood the final rule. It wasn't watching from inside the house. The house was the interface. I didn't move that day. Unpacked, I resumed my routine. The lights dimmed to normal. The tapping stopped. Online, the threads I'd bookmarked were gone, like they'd never existed. My search history showed nothing. I stopped looking into it after that. That's when it followed me. They already knew my name. I hadn't even closed the trunk when the voice came from my left, cheerful and confident, like we'd met before. "You must be Daniel," the man said. "Welcome to the block." I froze with one hand on a box labeled Qi Qian, my pulse thudding in my ears. I hadn't introduced myself to anyone yet. I hadn't even changed my license address. He was smiling, flanked by 2 others who hovered just behind him, matching expressions, matching posture. Friendly. Open. Normal. That was the worst part. "I'm Mark," he continued, extending his hand. "And this is Susan and Tom. We like to greet new neighbors properly." I shook his hand because not doing so would have been stranger than anything else. His grip lingered a second too long. "Daniel," Susan repeated softly, like she was tasting it. "You picked a good house. Quiet street. Very observant neighbors." Something in the way she said observant made my stomach tighten. Over the next few days they kept appearing. Not all at once. One at a time. Always casual. Always with reasons. Dropping off flyers I hadn't seen anywhere else. Asking about trash days I already knew. Commenting on things I hadn't shared. Mark mentioned my job during a conversation I was sure I'd never had with him. Tom asked how my sister was doing after her surgery. Susan laughed about a nightmare I'd had the night before, one I hadn't told anyone about. When I corrected them, they exchanged glances, quick and subtle, like I'd missed a cue. "Oh," Mark said once, chuckling, "you'll get used to it." The friendliness intensified. Blocked dinners. Group chats I was added to without giving my number. Smiles that felt rehearsed. Laughter that arrived on cue. I noticed they spoke in the same phrases sometimes, finishing each other's sentences, like they were reading from a shared script. One evening, as the sun dipped low and porch lights flicked on in unison, Mark leaned closer and lowered his voice. "We all look out for each other here," he said. "That's how it works. What happens if someone doesn't?" I asked, trying to sound light. His smile didn't falter. "They leave." I started seeing patterns after that. Curtains opening at the same time. Doors closing together. Conversations pausing when I stepped outside. They knew where I was going before I said it. They asked questions I'd only thought about. The worst part wasn't the attention. It was the inevitability. The sense that this had happened before, that my role was already written. I caught neighbors watching other houses too, heads turning together, attention shifting like a single organism deciding where to focus next. Sometimes I heard my name whispered from different directions at once. I tried avoiding them, took longer routes, stayed inside. It didn't help. They adapted, smiling wider, giving me space that felt rehearsed too, like restraint was part of the plan. Late one night, I found a note slipped under my door. No handwriting, just printed words. Welcome, DL. Gee, I stood there a long time holding the paper, listening to footsteps outside, stopping, starting, circling my house like a shared thought passing between minds. The next morning, every house on the block had the same porch light on, even in daylight. Every neighbor waved as I left for work. All of them said my name the same way, with the same emphasis, like a shared pronunciation lesson. That was when I realized I didn't just have one neighbor watching me everywhere always. I had all of them. Once you accept that you're being watched, the world doesn't get quieter. It gets organized. I started noticing how coordinated everything was. Not in an obvious, militaristic way. More like choreography. One neighbor would step outside, and another would follow 30 seconds later. Someone would start watering their lawn, and 3 others would do the same, hoses hissing in uneven harmony. If I changed my routine, theirs adjusted to accommodate it, like my movement was a variable they were solving for. They shared phrases. That was the first concrete proof that this wasn't coincidence. I'd hear Mark say, "Better safe than alone," and later that day Susan would repeat it verbatim to someone else. Tom used it too, nodding solemnly like a rule everyone understood. When I asked what it meant, they laughed, the same soft laugh, and said, "You'll learn." Symbols appeared next. Chalk marks on sidewalks that vanished by morning. Small carvings on fence posts. A shape I didn't recognize at first, but once I noticed it, I couldn't stop seeing it. Curved lines intersecting, always in groups of 3, on mailboxes, on trash bins. Scratched lightly into the wood of my porch railing, as if to test whether I'd react. I didn't confront anyone. That felt like instinct, not courage. Something in the air warned me against direct questions. When I tried to leave suddenly, called in sick, packed a bag, got in my car, every garage door on the block opened at once. Not all the way, just enough to remind me I was seen. So I learned the rules by watching. Don't confront them. They interpret that as aggression. Don't leave suddenly. Sudden movements attract attention. Don't let them inside. That last one was the hardest, because I realized too late it wasn't entirely up to me. They found excuses. Dropping things off, asking to borrow tools, standing just close enough to the threshold that the boundary blurred. Once, Mark's foot crossed into my doorway, and the air in the house shifted instantly like pressure equalizing. I forced a laugh and stepped outside instead. That seemed to satisfy them. At night, I heard movement between houses. Not footsteps, sliding, coordinated, like something passing through shared space. My walls creaked in ways they hadn't before. Sometimes I heard murmuring, overlapping voices that never quite formed words, except for my name, repeated with gentle insistence. I went back through the stories I'd saved, the ones from other neighborhoods. Different details, same structure. Friendly introductions, shared language, gradual enclosure. One account mentioned a man who tried to fight back. Shouting, threatening, calling the police daily. His story ended mid-sentence. Another described a woman who locked herself inside and never opened the door again. Her house was listed for sale a month later, freshly painted. That's when I understood what "they leave" really meant. I planned my escape carefully. Slowly. I started planning the idea weeks in advance, mentioning casually that I might move someday. Watching their reactions. Measuring approval. When I finally listed the house, they congratulated me. Helped me clean. Their hands lingered on my boxes, on my furniture, like they were memorizing weight and shape. On my last night, Mark came by alone. He stood on the porch, smiling softly. "You did well," he said. "Most people panic. What happens now?" I asked. He tilted his head. "No, someone else gets the house. I left at dawn. No rush, no sudden movements." As I drove away, every neighbor stood outside, waving in unison. In my rearview mirror, The block looked peaceful, normal, the kind of place you'd want to live. 2 weeks later, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the listings online. My old house was back on the market. The photos were new. The furniture wasn't mine. The walls were bare of symbols. In one picture, taken from the street, I saw the neighbors standing just out of frame, shadows stretching toward the porch. The description read ku ui tifiern dly na I gitvoar stiens af kam y. I closed the page and didn't sleep that night. I kept thinking about patterns. About how the first story had one neighbor, the second had a house, and this one had many, different scales, same shape. Whatever this was, it adapted. It learned it didn't need basements or crawl spaces or empty houses anymore. It worked through people, through groups, through the shared belief that nothing was wrong as long as everyone smiled. Sometimes late at night, I still hear it. Soft coordination in unfamiliar places. A pause in conversation when I enter a room. Too many eyes adjusting at once. I escape the block. I don't think I escaped them. By now, you've probably noticed the same thing I did when I laid these stories side by side. None of them give answers. No clear villain. No rule book you can memorize to stay safe. Just patterns that repeat in different shapes, like the same problem trying new solutions. One neighbor. One house. A whole block. Each story scales up, but the core stays the same. Something watches. Something learns routines. Something depends on silence more than fear. In every case, the danger wasn't obvious at first. It blended in. It borrowed sugar. It kept the lights on. It smiled and waved and knew your name before you offered it. I wish I could tell you these were rare, that I only found 3. I didn't. These are the ones that fit together cleanly enough to share. There are others sitting in folders I don't open anymore. Messages where the details line up too closely with where I live now. Stories that end with requests I can't safely honor. Some people asked me to stop uploading altogether. Not because they were scared, but because they were recognized. That's the part that keeps me up. Whatever this is, it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need secrecy in the dramatic sense. It relies on politeness. On the assumption that neighbors are just neighbors, houses are just houses, and patterns are just coincidences. It thrives in that gap between noticing something is wrong and deciding not to say it out loud. If you're listening to this and thinking of someone nearby, someone who stands a little too close, knows a little too much, or never quite leaves their house, that thought didn't come from nowhere. I'm not saying panic. Panic breaks rules you don't know you're following yet. I'm saying pay attention. Compare notes. Notice who benefits from silence. Because the most unsettling realization I've had through all of this isn't that these things exist. It's that they don't need to hide very hard anymore. They just need us to keep assuming we're alone in noticing them. There's a point in every one of these stories where something could have changed. A call made. A question asked out loud. A moment where someone compared notes instead of laughing it off. That point usually passes quietly, without drama, because nothing terrible has happened yet. That's what makes it so easy to miss. If you're still listening, you're already doing the one thing most people don't, sitting with the discomfort instead of rushing past it. I know the urge now is to rationalize, to tell yourself these are just stories, or that you'd notice something like this immediately. I hope you're right. I really do. But if any detail stuck with you a little too strongly, if a name, a habit, or a house nearby surfaced in your mind without being invited, don't ignore that. You don't have to act. You don't have to accuse. Just pay attention. Patterns don't mean much alone, but they mean everything when shared. If you want to talk about this, the comments are open. People read them more closely than you think. Share what you've noticed, or don't. Silence is safer in the short term. That's what all of these stories have in common. I'll keep collecting accounts as long as people keep sending them. Though there are some I won't read out loud anymore. Some doors don't close once you acknowledge what's behind them. Some neighbors notice when you start asking the wrong questions. So tonight, when the street gets quiet and the lights settle into their familiar patterns, resist the urge to check. Don't look out the window. Don't reassure yourself with a glance. If your neighbor has been a little too quiet lately, don't check. Just listen.